stray dog went to the cemetery every day, and when the gravedigger decides to follow him, he discovers something shocking that makes him cry and changes his life forever. Have you ever seen a dog express feelings so deeply that it seems human? Some people say that animals understand more than we realize, that they feel our absence, our pain, and even our deepest secrets. But how far does this connection go? How far does the loyalty of a dog who lost everything he loved most go? It was a cold morning when the cemetery caretaker noticed something unusual. Among the silent tombs and the withered flowers scattered across the ground, there was a dog. It wasn't just any lost dog or just wandering around aimlessly. There was something different about him. His gaze carried a sadness that was difficult to explain. But what caught the most attention was what he held between his teeth, a flower. It wasn't the first time. Without anyone knowing where he came from or where he was going, every week, on exactly the same day, the dog appeared. He didn't ask for food, he didn't look for shelter. He just walked slowly between the tombs until he reached one in particular. Then, gently, he left the flower right there, in the same exact place. Afterwards, he lay down next to the tombstone, as if he was waiting for something or someone. This ritual, so simple and silent, soon caught the attention of gravediggers and visitors to the cemetery. Some thought it was beautiful, others found it strange. Who would have taught this dog to act this way, and why? Without understanding, some cemetery employees began to observe him more closely. He didn't seem scared or suspicious of the people around him, but he didn't show any interest in them either. His objective was clear: to get to that tomb, deposit the flower, and stay there for a while in complete silence. Then he would get up and leave, only to return the following week. Days passed, and the mystery only increased. Nobody knew where he came from. No resident of the region recognized the dog, and no family who visited the cemetery knew how to explain its presence. But one thing was certain: that dog wasn't there by chance. He didn't wander around without a reason. Something much bigger brought him back, week after week. There were those who said it belonged to someone buried there. Others believed he had simply found a place where he felt safe. But then, a question arose. Where did the flowers come from? No one had ever seen the dog carrying anything other than them. No sign of anyone leaving them for him. It was always a fresh flower, never withered. Who could be giving him those flowers? Or did he find them somewhere himself? Each week, curiosity increased. What led this dog to repeat the same ritual with such precision? What was it about that tomb that attracted him? And above all, whose presence did he seem to expect so much? The gravediggers began to notice small details. The way he approached, with slow, careful steps. The way he looked at the tombstone, as if he were communicating silently. And the exact moment when he closed his eyes and sighed deeply before lying down next to the grave. It was a behavior that conveyed something powerful, almost as if that dog was experiencing grief, but a grief that wouldn't go away. What if he was there waiting for someone who would never come back? Little by little, the story spread. Visitors who frequented the cemetery began leaving food and water for him. But curiously, the dog rarely touched what was offered to him. I wasn't there looking for food or shelter. He had another purpose, a motive stronger than any physical need. The days continued to pass, and no one could ignore that look. A look that carried longing, who seemed to beg for something that no one there could give him, until one day someone decided to follow in his footsteps after he left the cemetery. Where was he going? Where did you spend the rest of the week? Who, after all, was that dog that never missed his visit? The answer was closer than everyone imagined, but when they found out, no one could hold back their tears. Have you ever noticed how animals create habits that to us seem inexplicable? A dog that waits for its owner at the door every day, a cat that always lies down in the same corner of the house, a bird that sings to someone specific. But what about when a ritual goes beyond the ordinary? When a dog, without anyone teaching him, repeats a gesture so moving that it makes us question how far the memory and love of an animal goes. At the cemetery, that dog's routine soon became impossible to ignore. Week after week, without fail, he showed up, always on the same day, always at the same time, and in his mouth he had a flower. At first, the gravediggers only noticed his presence. He appeared as a silent figure among the tombs, walked slowly to the same tombstone, and placed his flower there, as if fulfilling a duty. Then he would lie down next to the grave and remain there motionless, breathing deeply, his eyes fixed on a distant point. No sound, no barking, no seeking for attention. At first, The cemetery workers thought he was just lost. Perhaps he had been abandoned and found refuge there. But it didn't take long for them to realize that wasn't the case. He didn't wander aimlessly. He didn't explore the place. He didn't interact with other visitors. His objective was clear: get to the tomb, leave the flower, and stay there as if he were waiting for something or someone. This routine, which at first seemed like a simple habit, began to awaken a mix of curiosity and emotion in the gravediggers. Who was this dog? Where did he come from? And above all, what did this insistence on always returning to the same place mean? It was then that one of the employees decided to take a closer look at him. That day, instead of carrying on with his usual work, he stayed at a distance, paying attention to the dog's every movement. You saw when he arrived exactly at the usual time. She noticed the way he held the flower delicately, without chewing it or letting it fall, the way he walked, without deviating to anything around him, as if everything outside that route was irrelevant. And as he lay down next to the tombstone, the gravedigger noticed something that no one had noticed before. The dog closed his eyes and sighed deeply, as if relieving a weight he was carrying. This was not a random gesture. It wasn't unreasonable behavior. He was there for something or someone. The days passed and curiosity only increased. Other employees started paying more attention. They tried to get closer, but the dog didn't seem to notice the human presence. He didn't show fear, but he also didn't seek affection. His world seemed limited to that small space next to the tombstone, and there was another detail that no one could ignore: the flowers. Every week, a new flower. Always fresh, always different. But where did they come from? No one had ever seen the dog picking up the flowers anywhere else. He just showed up with them. There were no flower beds nearby, nor well-kept gardens in the cemetery. Some of the gravediggers decided to test something. They started leaving flowers near the grave to see if the dog would pick them up, but he never touched them. He only brought his own. It was as if only the ones he chose had meaning. By this time, the story was already circulating among visitors to the cemetery. Some people began to wait for the day he would appear, only to see him repeat his silent ritual. Some were moved, others just watched, trying to understand what was going on in that animal's mind. And one question echoed in everyone's mind: what was his relationship with that tomb? Each week the mystery grew, and with it, the desire to discover the truth. It was then that one of the gravediggers made a decision. If that dog had a certain destination within the cemetery, then it also had a starting point, and the only way to solve this enigma was to follow him. That day, when the dog got up from the grave and started to walk away, one of the employees followed him from afar, without making a sound, and what he discovered left everyone speechless. Have you ever seen an animal demonstrate loyalty in a way that seemed impossible? Tobias teaches us that true love has no end. If you've ever had a pet that showed you this type of connection, share your story in the comments. Press the subscribe button to follow more exciting stories like this, and leave a like so that more people can discover stories that touch the soul. Have you ever seen a dog choose a place as if it had a greater purpose, as if you knew exactly where to go, without hesitation, without doubts? Some say that animals have a sensitivity that we humans will never fully understand. But what made that dog always return to the same grave, as if he was fulfilling a silent promise? Day after day, he repeated the same ritual. As soon as he arrived at the cemetery, he walked with slow, steady steps without deviating from the path. It didn't matter if there was wind, if it rained, or if the sun was beating down on the cold ground between the tombstones. He never hesitated, never made a mistake. His gaze was deep, filled with a feeling that was difficult to decipher. Sadness, hope, longing, or all of this at the same time. The silence around him made everything even more intense. No barking, no asking for attention. Just that calm walk as if carrying an invisible weight. And then when he arrived, he would stop. With a delicacy that did not match his canine nature, he lowered his head and placed the flower right there at the base of the tombstone. He never pushed her with his nose, he never played with her. He just left it where he thought it should be. Then he remained motionless. The minutes passed, and he remained there in absolute silence, in no rush to leave. His body remained relaxed, but his fixed gaze revealed something deeper. He waited, but what exactly did he expect? Some people visiting the cemetery began to notice. Some were moved, others just watched from afar, without the courage to interfere. There was something about that dog that commanded respect. something that made anyone hesitate before interrupting his moment. But there was a doubt that no one could ignore. Who was buried there? Why that tomb, among so many others? What was the connection that kept that dog tied to that place? The tombstone was simple. No statues, no flashy decorations, just a name, a date, and a short epitaph, like so many others in the cemetery. But to that dog, that tombstone was more than a cold stone. It was a meeting point, an invisible link that he refused to break. What was there? Was he waiting for someone to come back? Did he understand that that tomb held someone who would never return? The gravediggers began to wonder if he recognized the name engraved there. If somehow the memory of that puppy still kept the voice, the smell, the touch of who now rested beneath that earth. And the more they observed, the more they became sure of one thing. It wasn't just a habit. The way he lay down, the way his eyes were lost in the immensity, his heavy breathing as if he carried a longing that he couldn't express in words. It was as if every time he appeared there, he was reliving something. And then, when there seemed to be nothing left to do, he would get up. As calmly as he arrived, he shook his body slightly, took a deep breath, and began to walk away. It was as if he was saying goodbye once again, as if he was saying, in his silence, a see you soon to someone who, deep down, he knew he would never see again. Cemetery officials began to worry. They saw that dog coming back week after week, always carrying his flower, always repeating the same ritual at the graveside. He had no collar, no apparent owner. No one knew where he slept or what he ate, and as silent as his presence was, there was something unsettling about that scene. Was he lost? Did someone abandon him, and he just found refuge there? At first, one of the gravediggers tried to push him away. If he had an owner, maybe he would come home. If it was just a stray dog, it could find another place to shelter. On the first attempt, he clapped his hands and signaled for the dog to go away. But the dog didn't even move. He just remained there, lying next to the tombstone, as if he hadn't even heard. Then another employee tried something different. He took a piece of bread he had in his pocket and used it as bait, calling the dog away from the tomb. He waved the piece of bread in the air, whistled, tried to attract the animal. Nothing. The dog looked at him for a brief moment without interest, and then looked back at the tombstone. That was weird. Stray dogs are often driven by hunger. Anyone living without a home would accept a piece of bread, but he doesn't. It was as if his hunger was different. Gradually, frustration began to grow among employees. The dog didn't move. He didn't ask for anything, but he also didn't obey the signs to leave, so they decided to be firmer. One of the gravediggers stamped his foot on the ground near him, trying to scare him. The dog slowly raised his head, looked into his eyes, and, after a brief sigh, simply lowered his head again. No reaction, no fear, no resistance. He didn't growl, he didn't run away, he didn't fight back. It just was still there. What else could they do? That day when the cemetery closed, one of the employees decided to take him out. He whistled, clapped his hands, and, as nothing helped, started walking towards him, ready to guide him to the gate. The dog stood up slowly as if he knew there was no point in resisting. He walked to the exit without difficulty, without hiding, without showing any discomfort. It just was. But the next day, there he was again, with another flower, with the same slow steps, with the same look full of something that no one could explain, and it was like that every time. The gravediggers tried to stop him more than once, but nothing worked. No matter what they did, he always came back. Every week, on the same day, every week the same ritual. Over time, employees began to give up trying to remove him, not because they couldn't, but because deep down, they felt that that puppy wasn't there for no reason. Gradually, resistance gave way to acceptance. Instead of shooing him away, they began to observe him. Instead of trying to expel him, they started to respect his space. And it was at that moment that they realized something that no one expected. He wasn't just any street dog. He had a story, and she was about to be discovered. Have you ever wondered what goes through a dog's mind when he loses someone he loves? Do they understand what happened? Do they feel the absence the same way we do? Some say that dogs live in the present, that they don't carry the weight of longing like humans do. But Tobias proved that this wasn't true. For weeks he had been a mystery in the cemetery. He appeared on the same day at the same time, followed the same path, and left his flower on the same grave. Nothing kept him away. Nothing made him change his ritual, until someone decided it was time to find out who he really was. Cemetery workers, intrigued by his insistence, began asking visitors if anyone recognized him, but no one could say where he had come from. It was then that one of the gravediggers had an idea. Perhaps the name engraved on the tombstone would reveal some clue. The grave Tobias was visiting belonged to a man named Manuel. The tomb was simple, with nothing too striking. Just a short phrase carved into the stone: "Love never dies." Those words, which could go unnoticed by anyone, suddenly seemed to make sense. The question that no one could ignore now was, who was Manuel? One of the employees decided to investigate. He asked local residents, talked to visitors who frequently went to the cemetery, and tried to piece together pieces of history. And little by little, the answers began to emerge. Manuel was a lonely elderly man who had passed away months before. "I lived in a simple house with no family around, but there was something everyone knew about him. He was never alone. He was always accompanied by his dog, the dog that everyone now knew as Tobias." Upon hearing that name for the first time, one of the employees got goosebumps. No one had ever thought of calling him. No one had ever imagined that he could react. But the next day, when Tobias appeared again at the cemetery, someone whispered his name, Tobias, and for the first time, he reacted. His gaze, which until then always seemed lost in the immensity, lit up for a brief moment. He tilted his head slightly, as if trying to recognize that voice, that name. It was as if, after so long, he was hearing something familiar, something that made sense. From that moment on, everything fell into place. Tobias was not just a stray dog who had found refuge in the cemetery. He wasn't there by chance. He was there because that was the only place where he still felt his owner nearby. The routine that cemetery workers had witnessed for so many weeks now had an explanation. Tobias wasn't just visiting a tomb. He was going to find someone he never wanted to leave behind. And then a doubt arose. How did he know where Manuel was buried? This was the missing piece of the puzzle. And the answer, no one was prepared to hear it. Do you believe that an animal can feel what we feel? That he is capable of sharing joys, sadness, and even the deepest pains? If so, then you will understand the story of Tobias and Manuel, a story that makes us reflect on the bonds that, even invisible, are stronger than time and distance. Manuel's life was peaceful, but marked by a deep longing. He lived alone in a small house on the outskirts of the city. For those who knew him, Manuel had always been a reserved man of few words. There was no family around, and the days seemed to pass without any major events. But everything changed the day he found a small puppy, abandoned on a busy street. It was any day, but for Manuel that day would become unforgettable. The dog, small and thin, was hiding between some cardboard boxes, scared and alone. His eyes, although filled with fear, also carried a silent curiosity, as if he was waiting for someone to notice him. Manuel, as he passed by, stopped for a moment. There was something in that look that touched him deeply. Maybe it was the fact that, at that moment, Manuel also felt a little lost, a little alone, just like the little dog. Without thinking twice, he bent down, extended his hand, and said softly, "Come on, you come with me." And that's how Manuel and Tobias's story began. The puppy wasn't just a new friend. Tobias became part of Manuel's life in ways no one could have predicted. From the moment they crossed the gate of the house, it seemed as if they were destined for each other, as if they both needed to fill an absence that only they understood. Manuel's days soon took on a new meaning. Tobias was a puppy full of energy and curiosity, always exploring corners of the house and playing with everything he found. But what caught the most attention was how quickly he became attached to his new owner. Where Manuel was going, Tobias was right behind. And little by little, that lonely house filled with life again. Manuel was a man of simple habits. His daily routine included long walks around the neighborhood, and he never left without Tobias by his side. Every afternoon, before the sunset, they followed the same path, a route that led to the small square in the center of the neighborhood. The walk wasn't just a stroll, it was a special moment for both of them. In the square there was a flower bed that Manuel deeply admired. He always picked some flowers, chose the most beautiful ones, and took them with him. For many it was just a simple gesture without great meaning, but for Manuel those flowers carried much greater symbolism. Along the way, he used to talk to Tobias, as if the dog could understand every word. And maybe Tobias really understood, because he always looked at Manuel carefully, as if he really understood. Manuel talked about the past, about the memories he kept, about the good days and the difficult ones. And among so many stories, there was one that he never stopped telling. Manuel had lost his wife a few years ago, a pain he carried every day, even if he didn't show it openly. They had shared a life together, and his absence was a void that nothing seemed to fill. However, he never stopped visiting her. Every week Manuel brought flowers to her grave, always repeating the same words, which Tobias would soon learn to hear: "Love never dies." These walks to the square and then to the cemetery became the most important ritual in Manuel's life, and Tobias, who always accompanied him, seemed to understand the importance of that gesture. He watched carefully as Manuel carefully placed the flowers and lay down next to the tomb in respectful silence. The puppy never made noise, never ran or was distracted. He just lay down next to Manuel as if he was also paying silent homage. Anyone who saw them there might not have imagined what was really happening, but for those who knew the story, it was impossible not to be moved. Tobias grew up alongside Manuel, accompanying each of these visits. If there was sun, rain, or wind, they went together. It didn't matter the weather. It didn't matter the tiredness. Manuel always picked the most beautiful flowers he found, and Tobias always walked by his side. They formed an inseparable duo, one supporting the other, one filling the void that the other carried. Over time, people in the neighborhood got to know Tobias. He was more than Manuel's dog. He was a symbol of loyalty, a companion who never left his owner's side. Even those who didn't know the full story were moved to see them together. The connection between them was evident, something that transcended words. And so, the years passed. Tobias was getting older, just like Manuel, but the love between them only seemed to grow stronger with time. Manuel no longer walked as quickly as before, but Tobias remained by his side, always faithful, always attentive. Then one day, something changed. Manuel, who had always been so punctual in his visits, stopped appearing in the square. People in the neighborhood noticed his absence, but no one knew for sure what had happened. All they knew was that suddenly, Tobias started walking alone. The puppy, who never left Manuel's side, now wandered the streets with the air of someone looking for something he couldn't find. His steps were slower. His gaze seemed lost. He no longer ran to the square with the same enthusiasm. He didn't lie down to rest while Manuel picked the flowers. That's when everything started to make sense. Manuel had passed away. Without fanfare, without goodbyes, he simply left, leaving a huge void in Tobias's life. But the dog didn't know what had happened. For him, Manuel was still somewhere waiting to be found. He hadn't seen his owner leave. He hadn't understood that that absence was definitive. And so Tobias began to retrace the path he had walked so many times alongside Manuel. Alone, he crossed the streets, passed through the square, looked around, as if searching for something that was out of reach. And one day he found something that looked familiar: the cemetery. No one knew for sure how Tobias discovered where Manuel was buried, but somehow he knew. Maybe it was the smell of the flowers, or maybe it was the memory of the paths they took together. What mattered was that he found the place, found the tomb, and that's when his ritual began. Tobias started visiting Manuel's grave, just as he did with him when they went together to bring flowers to his wife. Now he was alone, but he seemed determined to maintain that tradition. Each flower that Tobias carried was like a message, a gesture of love and longing that would not fade with time. The connection Tobias had with Manuel did not end with death. On the contrary, she became stronger. The dog, who had lost everything he had, still kept his owner's memory alive in the only way he knew how. And each visit to the cemetery was as if he said, "I'm still here, I haven't forgotten you." This was the true story of Tobias, a cub who knew no words but understood more about love and loyalty than most humans. A puppy who, even after everything, still refused to abandon those who rescued him, those who loved him, those who made him feel like he had a home. And now the question everyone was asking was, how long would Tobias continue? How long could that bond, even in the face of everything, still resist? The simplest gestures often carry the deepest meanings. A silent look, a light touch, an object left in a special place. Everything can be a message without words. For Tobias, a single flower carried a world of feelings. Each week, he repeated the same ritual. He arrived at the cemetery with a flower in his mouth, walked without hesitation to Manuel's tomb, and placed the flower delicately. Then he lay down next to the tombstone, took a deep breath, and closed his eyes. a gesture that no one taught him, but that seemed to come from a deep place within him. What made that dog repeat this ritual? Why the flowers? The answer began to emerge when the gravediggers decided to investigate further about Manuel. They already knew that Tobias was their faithful companion, and that together they used to visit the tomb of the elderly man's wife. But when talking to Manuel's old neighbors, they discovered a detail that gave everything new meaning. There was a phrase that Manuel often said, "Love never dies." He repeated these words whenever he picked flowers to take to the cemetery. It was almost a mantra, something he murmured fondly as he chose the best flowers for his late wife. Tobias, who never left his side, heard this phrase countless times, and then came the revelation that left everyone goosebumps. On the day Manuel passed away, he was holding a flower in his hand. That's how they found him. Alone at home, his body rested in silence, and between his fingers was a freshly picked flower. It was as if, until the last moment, his heart was still tied to the love he never forgot, as if even though he was leaving, he wanted to keep alive the gesture he repeated so many times throughout his life. And now, Tobias did the same. But where did the flowers come from? The cemetery workers noticed that no matter how much of a stray Tobias was after Manuel's death, his flowers were never withered, never looked like they were plucked from an unkept garden. They were always fresh, chosen with care. When they followed Tobias after one of his visits, they discovered the origin of the flowers. The dog didn't pick up any flowers on the way. Instead, he headed to the same square where he used to walk with Manuel. There, among the flower beds, Tobias sniffed, analyzed for a moment, and then chose a flower, the most beautiful one he could find. He didn't choose randomly. He chose as Manuel chose. Those who saw the scene were speechless. Even without understanding death like humans, Tobias seemed to have absorbed the meaning of that gesture. He wasn't just picking flowers, he was continuing what Manuel did, and every week with the same loyalty, he returned to the cemetery, took his flower, and repeated the gesture of the man he loved so much. It was proof that, for him, Manuel was still there. The longing didn't go away, the love didn't diminish. What Manuel taught him, Tobias never forgot, and with each flower, he proved that, in fact, love never dies. There are moments in life that seem small, but when we look back, we realize that they were the end of an era. For Tobias, that day seemed like any other. He was next to Manuel, listening to his calm voice and feeling his gentle touch. This was the way things had always been, and Tobias believed they always would be. But life sometimes changes without warning. Manuel no longer walked as easily as before. His steps were slower. His hands shook slightly when he held the flowers he picked. Tobias noticed these changes. He sat next to the elderly man, watching him with those attentive eyes that seemed to understand much more than anyone imagined. That afternoon, Manuel was quieter, different. They were sitting in the old rocking chair on the porch of the house when Tobias felt the light touch of the elderly man's hand on his head. It was a common gesture, but this time there was something different. The touch took longer than usual, as if it were a farewell. It was at that moment that Manuel whispered, "Love never dies." It was the phrase he always said, but this time his voice was lower, weaker. Tobias didn't understand. He just closed his eyes for a moment, enjoying that affection. But when he opened them again, Manuel was no longer there in the same way. His gaze had been lost on the horizon. His breathing had become almost imperceptible. Tobias waited for him to say something again, but the silence was absolute. The dog lightly nudged Manuel's leg with his nose, as he always did when he wanted attention, but there was no response. Then he laid his head on the elderly man's lap and remained there, as if the heat of Manuel's body could tell him what to do next. But this time, Manuel didn't get up to pick flowers. He didn't tie his shoes for the afternoon walk. He didn't call Tobias to follow him. The house looked different that day. People came and went. Some were crying, others spoke quietly, and Tobias watched everything without completely understanding. He didn't see Manuel anywhere. His scent was still there, but something was wrong. When the door was finally closed and silence took over, Tobias stood still for a while. He looked around, waiting for Manuel to return. "May your familiar voice call your name." But the house was empty, and for the first time Tobias was alone. Time passed strangely for him. The days were born and died without the touch of Manuel's hand, without his soft words, without the walks to the square. He still went there, still sniffed the flowers, but something was missing. And then the longing turned into a search. Tobias began to wander the streets. His instinct guided him, even if he didn't know exactly where to go. He followed familiar paths, past the places where they usually walked, looked around every corner as if he expected to find Manuel there waiting for him. But Manuel never showed up. It was then that something changed. On one of his solitary walks, Tobias smelled a familiar smell. It was a smell he associated with something important, something that reminded him of Manuel, a smell that was always present on their walks together. The flowers. The dog's nose, sharp and precise, picked up that familiar scent, and without hesitation, he followed the trail. When he realized it, he was in front of the cemetery gates. It was a place he knew. He had been there before, but this time, Manuel was not by his side. Tobias entered, walking among the tombs, sniffing the ground. He moved slowly, as if he was being guided by something, invisible, until it stopped. In front of him, a simple tombstone. The name engraved there meant nothing to him, but the smell, the feeling, the energy of that place, he knew. Tobias approached and lay down next to the tombstone, waited. Time passed, and nothing happened. No voice called out to him, no hand touched his head, but Tobias remained there, looking at the horizon, as if he expected that at any moment, Manuel would appear walking between the tombstones, smiling at him. But Manuel didn't return, and so Tobias did what he always did when he felt something was incomplete. He went to the square, chose a flower, he returned to the cemetery, and he placed it there. It was the only way he knew to keep Manuel close, to continue doing what they did together. And so their ritual began. Every week Tobias followed the same path. He looked for the most beautiful flower, carried it delicately, and returned to the cemetery. It was what he knew how to do. It was his way of saying he was still there, which I still remembered, because deep down he knew that Manuel wouldn't forget him either, because love never dies. Some days seem ordinary until something happens that changes everything. It was like that with Tobias. For weeks, for months, he followed his ritual. Always on the same day, always at the same time, he arrived at the cemetery with a flower in his mouth, walked slowly between the tombstones, and lay down next to the same grave. The gravediggers had already gotten used to that scene. It was something that at first caused strangeness, then admiration, and finally deep respect. No one tried to push him away anymore. On the contrary, some even waited for him. He became part of that place. But then, one day, something was different. The clock showed the time Tobias usually arrived, but he didn't show up. At first, the gravediggers didn't pay much attention. Maybe he was late. Maybe he was resting in some corner of the city. But, as time passed and he did not appear, the uneasiness began to grow. One of them commented, "Did something happen to him?" The question hung in the air, filled with concern. Tobias had never failed. He always showed up. Always. The gravediggers decided to look for him. They walked around the cemetery, called out to him, and asked some visitors if they had seen him. But no one could say where Tobias was. It was then that one of them had a feeling. They returned to Manuel's tomb, and there, lying on the cold earth, they found Tobias. He was in the same position as always, but something was different. In your mouth, a flower, the same one he always brought. But this time he didn't let go. The gravediggers approached carefully, called his name, and lightly touched his body. But Tobias didn't react. He didn't get up. His body was motionless, but his countenance was serene. He didn't seem scared, nor in pain. He looked at peace. It was as if he knew this would be his last visit. As if, that day, when looking for his flower, he understood that he no longer needed to repeat that ritual. He had accomplished his mission. Tobias's story spread throughout the city. People who had never seen him in person heard about the dog who, even after his owner's death, never stopped showing his love and loyalty. And the next day, something unexpected happened. The tomb where Tobias always lay began to receive flowers. But this time, he wasn't the one bringing them, and that was just the beginning. Some bonds are so deep that neither time nor distance nor even death can break them. Tobias proved this in a way that no one could forget. He spent weeks, months, maybe years, repeating his ritual. Every week, he would look for a flower, cross the city, and go to the cemetery, where he would deposit his small gift on Manuel's tomb. He lay down next to the tombstone, sighed deeply, and closed his eyes. As if, for a few minutes, you could feel the presence of your best friend once again. But on that last day, he didn't get up. There were no signs of distress. There was no anguish. He just left. there, in the same place where he had learned the true meaning of loyalty. News of Tobias's departure spread quickly. The gravediggers, who previously only observed their ritual in silence, were the first to be moved. One of them, unable to contain his tears, whispered, "He stayed until the end." And that was the truth. Even after Manuel's death, Tobias remained faithful to his friend. He never looked for a new home. He never looked for another human to occupy that space, because for him Manuel was still there, and maybe he was. Some people say that dogs don't understand the concept of death, that they just feel the absence. But Tobias seemed to know more than anyone. He knew where Manuel was. He knew how to find it. And in the end, he chose to stay by your side. That scene, Tobias lying next to the tombstone, with a flower between his teeth, was marked in the memory of everyone who saw it. But what no one expected was what would happen next. In the following days, Manuel's tomb was not empty. People began to appear, some familiar, some strangers, all carrying flowers. They arrived in silence. Some stopped for a few minutes. Others simply left their tribute and left. It didn't take long for that small space in the cemetery to be filled with colors, flowers of all types, some collected with care, others brought from far away. But they all carried the same meaning. It was as if Tobias had taught something without having to say a word. Love never dies, and his story would never be forgotten. Some stories are so powerful that they span time and touch even those who have never met their protagonists. Tobias never spoke, never wrote letters, never asked for recognition. All he did was love unconditionally in his silent, faithful, pure way. And this love, without him knowing, spread far beyond the cemetery where he rested for the last time. After his departure, something happened. At first, there were just a few flowers. Small bouquets left by people who heard about the dog who never abandoned his owner. Some flowers were picked along the way, others were brought from flower shops. But regardless of their origin, they all carried the same meaning: respect, longing, and gratitude. The scene repeated itself every day. People who had never met Manuel, who had never seen Tobias, now visited that tomb. Some knelt down and closed their eyes for a moment, as if they were saying a silent prayer. Others just touched the tombstone delicately, leaving a flower next to it like Tobias did. The story began to spread even further. Local newspapers published reports about the dog who never forgot his owner. Social networks were filled with photos of the tomb covered in flowers, accompanied by emotional messages from people who felt touched by that demonstration of love and loyalty. And then something even bigger happened. The cemetery, previously a place of silence and goodbyes, began to receive visitors who came just to see the place where Tobias rested. They weren't just going for Manuel or Tobias himself, but for what they represented: a love that was not broken by death, a loyalty that has survived time, a lesson that not 1,000 words could explain as well as that dog explained with his actions. The cemetery employees, who had previously tried to remove him, now took care of that space with care. They never let the flowers wither, and some even started bringing water and food to other stray dogs, inspired by what Tobias taught without saying anything. But perhaps the most beautiful part of this story was the transformation it caused in people. Some began to look at their own dogs differently. They began to pay more attention, to value the small moments, to reciprocate that unconditional love that was always there, but that was often taken for granted. Others found Tobias's story comforting their own losses, because somehow he proved that no one is completely gone, as long as there is love to keep it alive in someone's memory. And so, year after year, Tobias was never forgotten, because he never forgot, and because, in the end, he was right. Stories like Tobias's make us feel something deep, something that we may not always be able to put into words, but you felt it. Somehow this story touched you, brought back memories, awakened emotions, and now you can make more people feel it too. Leave your "that's it" sign up, so that more people know stories like this, stories that remind us of what really matters. And if Tobias taught you something today, comment here: love never dies. Let's spread this message together. And now, one important thing. The next story appearing on your screen is even more exciting. You will learn about a story so surprising that it will make this feeling grow even more inside you. So, click now and keep feeling.